Welcome to Ziffity Quick Chat.
The choice between open source and SaaS is usually almost a philosophical one. I cannot subcontract out ownership of that data, that customer data, maybe to a third party. I have to have it myself. It's really better suited for, I would say, upper mid-market and enterprise brands because of the technical complexity that Headless implies. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have a complex headless build, but you don't have any developers on staff. I need to manage a brand, but I need to represent that brand differently in different countries and in different languages. And so Headless actually makes a certain amount of sense. BigCommerce has more headless builds on it than any other e-commerce platform. I highly recommend people take a look at the MACH Alliance.
Hi, folks. I'm Mackenzie Floyd from Ziffity Digital. Welcome to our podcast channel, Ziffity Quick Chat. The topic for today is how combining SaaS and headless commerce can enable e-commerce success. Customer experience matters the most for any business and especially for e-commerce. Well, why? Because e-commerce mutated from just a transactional website to a digital experience that provides the pleasure of shopping. Customer experience drives e-commerce, and getting it right is a high priority for any e-commerce business, no matter how big or small they are. In pursuit of achieving it, e-commerce brands have faced two major challenges for years. The first, they're unable to customize because of the rigidity of the platforms that they use and heavy development time and cost involved in customizing these experiences. Headless has chipped in and it's changed the scene for good. Headless commerce has really turned the dream of an e-commerce business having a great customer experience and top-notch technicalities into a reality. In this podcast, we'll be interacting with Aaron Sheehan. He's the Director of Competitive Strategy at BigCommerce. During our interaction, we're going to uncover how combining a SaaS e-commerce platform with a headless commerce approach will benefit a business and all the nitty-gritty involved. If you're an e-commerce brand using or looking to go for a SaaS platform, hopefully this podcast will answer a lot of your pressing questions. Hey, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for joining. Can you just give us some background on your experience in e-commerce and, a little bit about your role at BigCommerce?
Sure. So I've been in the e-commerce space for about 8 years, mostly on the agency side. So I guess competing against Ziffity at some level, potentially. Worked pretty heavily with Magento, all the way back to Magento 1 and Magento 2, worked with Salesforce Commerce Cloud, Shopify, and actually BigCommerce as a partner building websites for merchants. About 6 months ago, made the jump over to BigCommerce to step in as their Director of Competitive Strategy.
Awesome. Perfect. So you're the perfect person for us to ask some questions to.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I have a lot of opinions. So if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yep. So let's just get into it. What is headless commerce?
That's a pretty great question and more complicated than a lot of people think it is. And part of that is because there's a lot of buzzword sort of stew going on right now in the space. So if you go back a few years, headless was being used to describe generally like an e-commerce build where I might have had like a content management system, a separate content management system serving my pages and my front end that was decoupled from my backend where my product data, my order data, my transactional engine was. So you would see, for instance, WordPress as a pretty common front end with Magento in the back or something like that. And they would be integrated with one another. But you basically had headless was the adjective to describe Magento in that mode of deployment where there was no hedge to Magento. It was purely supplying data to WordPress or Acquia or Drupal or Adobe Experience Manager, prefiguring the later Adobe acquisition. As the landscape has matured, you see people take the position that headless, when describing a system, it's the same. It means that there is no head to it, but maybe there is not even there's a headless CMS or a headless front end, something like a Prismic on the front, where it's not even a full DXP or CMS. I'm building my pages basically and pulling the data from different systems to populate the different pages and experiences that I'm building on the site. So that's not to be confused with composable, which has sort of snuck in as a new industry term. So composable sometimes used interchangeably with headless. Really, if you think of headless as a good word to describe the e-com or the system, so I have a headless e-commerce system. Composable is the word for the deployment of multiple headless systems or API first systems in an entire stack. So in a composable like environment, I might have a separate search and merch service running from a separate CMS content service, running separately from a PIM, etc. Right? And so there are lots and lots of other buzzwords. I highly recommend checking out some industry publications. IDC and Gartner and Forrester all do quite a bit of thought leadership in this area. And there are plenty more terms and acronyms out there that we can get into. But pretty quickly, at a glance, headless just means my front end and my back end are on different systems.
That's a really great explanation. Thank you so much. So why should an e-commerce brand think of combining SaaS and headless?
So there are two sort of like primary reasons that I see merchants express interest in headless solutions for their e-commerce site. And the first one is, I would say, familiarity with the front end. So sometimes you will have a merchandising and marketing team at a merchant that is really used to a particular front-end tool, like a WordPress or an Adobe Experience Manager or Bloomreach, or like there's any number of possible front ends. And so they want to have a improve their e-commerce experience. Maybe they're trying to move away from on-premise software. Maybe they have, they're on something that's been end of life, either explicitly or not explicitly by the vendor. And they want to keep what they like, which is the front end that they are used, that serves them well, but they need to replace the plumbing underneath it. So it's like, I've got my house, I love my house, but the plumbing needs to switch. It's old iron pipes and I need to switch it to PVC, right? Like that's one reason why merchants will often talk about a headless deployment. The other one is when they want more control and freedom over their front end than a tightly coupled monolithic e-commerce platform will give them. Then you see this a lot, I think, more in the fashion or health and beauty space, where it's very brand first, very heavy design. So there's a lot of like redesigning with new line, like a new summer line or new spring line. I may totally want to redo my homepage and my landing pages as a result. That can be a challenge if you are in a very highly opinionated e-commerce platform that kind of like says, here's the template, you must sort of fit your site layout into this, and departing from that causes a lot of angst and pain. Sometimes a merchant will say, I want the freedom to basically have the choice to decide what the templates and layouts are going to be on my site, because my business and my brand depends on being constantly iterating on my look and my feel. So there are other reasons that people might be looking to avoid vendor lock-in. Maybe they simply, for contractual reasons or business reasons, don't want all their eggs in one basket. They don't want their entire primary web channel to be dependent on one single vendor. They want to spread that out. That's another reason. But usually it's because they either like what they have today on the front end and want to change the back end, or because they can't find a monolith that allows them to be as creative as they want to be with the front.
Right. Makes perfect sense. So with that said, do you think it's better to go for an open source CMS or custom build the front end, in the headless SaaS approach?
It's a hard question. You're going to hear it depends for me a lot, because there really aren't simple answers to a lot of these questions. It depends a lot on who you are as a merchant, right? Where we see where I've seen historically, I've been on the open source side for a long time. The merchants that make that work are ones who have a mature technical team on staff or on retainer through an agency, and they are comfortable with that team and the sort of the expense that incurs, because with great freedom comes great responsibility, right? And so if you have that level of freedom, then that means you are going to be on the hook. If I'm using an open source CMS, maybe I have to host it, I have to maintain it. If I'm using a SaaS-based CMS, that kind of goes away. If I'm not using a CMS and I'm just building everything from scratch myself, I'm gonna have to pay somebody to do that, obviously, because every time I need a page, I'm gonna have to call a developer to go build that page. But I see very few merchants actually want to go that route. Usually there's some kind of front end as a service or CMS or DXP somewhere in the mix that's being worked with. The choice between open source and SaaS is usually almost a philosophical one for the merchant to make, depending on what they're more comfortable with. Do I like owning and then having to like pay maintenance, or do I like leasing and not having to pay the maintenance? Is a lot of times how that comes down to it. There also may be regulatory and compliance reasons. If I'm in a highly regulated industry, I may have like, intrusive compliance and security and auditing needs that I need to own. I need to have my own databases. I need to run everything myself in-house, because I have to sort of like, I cannot subcontract out ownership of that data, that customer data, maybe to a third party. I have to have it myself. I've had those conversations a few times as well. So sometimes SaaS legally or regulatorily will not work for a particular merchant.
Got it. Yeah, there's a whole host of reasons why why that wouldn't work. So you mentioned fashion. What other types of e-commerce businesses do you think should go for the headless commerce approach?
I think it has less to do with your vertical and more to do with whether or not the two reasons I gave earlier resonate with you as a business. I mean, you can certainly make I can make some sort of generalizations from time working with different merchants. If you're selling spark plugs and automotive, aftermarket parts, you're probably less inclined to consistently refresh your site. The products are the thing that you're selling primarily. The products get refreshed. The products have photography and assets. But people aren't coming to buy spark plugs from me because my homepage is cool, right? Because my brand is cool. So they're coming to buy from me because they trust me and because I have the thing they need that's in stock because their car is busted, right? So like, with more sort of brand first approaches, often the brand first implies a level of creative control and constant change around the portrayal of that brand. That's why I sort of talked about health and beauty a little bit, and fashion is like, you tend to see more of that in those industries, but it's by no means limited to those industries.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think it's advisable for enterprise grade organizations as well?
I think it's almost more advisable for enterprise grade organizations. And the reason you talk about for headless, you mean for headless adoption?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really better suited for, I would say, upper mid-market and enterprise brands because of the technical complexity that headless implies. And there's a value in the simplicity of paying one license to one provider that gives me a platform that has my front and my back end, and I make a change on the back end and it immediately shows up on the front end, and I don't have to push anything or have middleware like translate. So you're handcuffed a little bit in the amount of change that you can do, but it's also much easier for you to operate. So if you're a smaller business and you don't have a lot of overhead and a lot of technical staff to manage that like consistent orchestration of pushing data from one system to another, it may be that headless will actually be frustrating for you. And so usually where I've seen merchants have success is that where they are, it doesn't necessarily mean that they do a lot. It's not about a revenue number. It's more about, do they have the technological know-how and the team inside of their org to facilitate the pace of change that they want to get out of their headless system? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a complex headless build, but you don't have any developers on staff and no way of sort of like leveraging it. So you don't want to buy something that is more horsepower than you need. If all I can do is drive around the golf course, I don't need necessarily an F350, right? Like, that's what I might use.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And we've talked about, challenges like high ownership costs, complexities in managing multiple systems. There's hurdles in replatforming, that's inevitable. Do you have any tips or advice for brands to address these challenges?
So for how to make it a little bit more accessible, to do
exactly.
kind of a, yeah, it's interesting. The landscape has changed. We're seeing new types of tools show up to help orchestrate sort of composable environments. So I'll give you a sort of a for instance. So Gartner, the analyst firm, released their what they have a regular report called their hype cycle. And so it's it's sort of a curve of, you've got various it's a bit sort of a curve where you've got the plateau of productivity over on the far right, where innovation has pretty much slowed down, but you've got a very sort of a commoditized or regular and predictable product offering. You've got the trough of disillusionment, the peak of inflated expectations, right? It's very colorful. But one of the things that's good for is it's a good publication. It's a good graphic for showing you new innovative technologies that are coming into the composable space. They've got a hype cycle for digital commerce that specifically does this. And so, for instance, but imagine a tool that lets a developer set up a digital experiences, and they can sort of like build it and then hand it to a business user to maintain and go, so that I don't have to have a developer involved in, say, launching a new product line or making a change to a product attribute value on a PDP. I have a way of, I have a tool basically that lets me connect an API from one system, let's say my PIM, to content stack, or a place where I have digital assets, and then connecting that to my front end, whatever my front end might be, so that I can orchestrate the pulling of data from disparate systems, unifying it and pushing it out to a particular front end, whatever I might have. So it's very new. So there's vendors like Uniform and Octu who are out there handling it. So I would recommend, if you're looking into this, maybe take a look at the wider sort of like the people selling tools for headless specifically. You might see value in there. And there's a lot of times the headless decision is driven by a dev team. So they should be making recommendations to you about the tooling that is important to them. But that would be an example of something where there are things available now that fill what would be manual labor, and now are able to automate that even inside of a composable build. So you slowly start piecing together parts of a composable solution through third-party vendors, or through your own team members, or through an agency, right? So I would say, go talk to all of those people, understand how what the operational impact is going to be of headless before you make that decision. Walk through some scenarios that are common to your business operationally, of like, creating a new category, creating a new product, filling orders, doing a promotion or a marketing campaign, doing a landing page for a paid search campaign, things that are pretty common in e-commerce. Those sorts of things will probably look different in a headless environment than they are today, for if you're thinking of transitioning in. So work through the space and all the parties involved, try to put together a coherent picture first before you sign contracts with vendors. Make sure that you get an idea of what the sort of the cost and impact is going to be of going that way.
Yeah, great tips. It's really important for people, to do their due diligence before implementing something like that. So in your opinion, what are the best platforms in the market that are facilitating kind of the SaaS plus headless approach?
Well, I have to say BigCommerce, right? I mean, sort of they're paying me, but yeah. I do believe that. I've actually been a BigCommerce fan for many years, and like I said, I was a partner before. When I first got involved with BigCommerce, headless wasn't really a big thing yet. But over the past few years, composability and headless has really taken off, especially in Europe. I've seen tremendous growth in Europe on the headless space. And I think that comes from the complexities of selling in a multi-language, multi-currency environment, where I need to manage a brand, but I need to represent that brand differently in different countries and in different languages. And so headless actually makes a certain amount of sense, because I have one place where I keep a lot of my core data, but then I'm able to set up the right glass, the right surface area to sell and market. And I can make those very bespoke and tailored. I'm not stuck sort of like with one template that I have to deploy to Portugal and Italy and the Nordics, right? And so it's a very different environment. And I think that like headless just lends itself to more complex environments like that. So obviously I would say BigCommerce has more headless builds on it than any other e-commerce platform.
Oh, really?
We do, yes, we do, and I think it's because we've been doing it for a long time, and we're also very accessible. It's very easy to get up and running, and you can also hybridize your headless builds. You can use BigCommerce's native stencil, template for pieces of your site, and use custom, software that you've built for other pieces of the site. So we're not forcing you to be headless or the entire way. You can mix and match depending on what your business needs. And it's a great way to sort of test out and see, maybe I want a third party handling my homepage and header and footer, but I'm content to let BigCommerce just render a product listing page and a PDP and a cart and a checkout, right? That's not uncommon at all. So obviously I would say us. I highly recommend people take a look at the MACH Alliance. That's MACH. That is a consortium of software vendors who all follow the same sort of headless philosophy and how they're built, right? So there are several e-commerce platforms in the MACH Alliance. There are several CMS and DXPs, search and merch tools. The digital experience orchestrators like Uniform that I was talking about earlier, they're also in the MACH Alliance. The MACH Alliance does quite a bit of thought leadership and curation of solutions to make sure that if you are talking to somebody in the Alliance, you can be sure that they actually are composably built and they're not a monolithic system pretending to be composable, which is starting to happen more and more. And I think the MACH Alliance is a great place to go because they've got all of the pieces of an e-commerce experience in their membership. So anybody in there is going to be a pretty good bet. Obviously, BigCommerce is a member of the MACH Alliance.
Right. Gotcha. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. That was a lot of insight, and I definitely believe your perspective on all these questions has answered a lot of our audience's questions that they might have had, in making decisions. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for the next one.
All right. Thanks, Mackenzie.
Thank you.